multidisciplinary artist from Toronto, showing premiering this important documentary here at Cinema Politica. It's an important film for us because it's an example of a non-Indigenous filmmaker working closely with Indigenous communities around his documentary practice. And actually, about a week and a bit ago, we had Jesse Wente here. He's a TIFF programmer, he's an Indigenous film critic, and he talked about this film and said this is an example of a white guy getting it right. So on that note, I would like to welcome Alex up to the stage.
Well, thank you. Where is it showing next? I just got off a tour. I showed it all around Treaty 4, 6, and 7. So let me think. Actually, I think it's going to be broadcast next. So it's going to kind of a dream scenario for me in a way. It's going to be on APTN, and then it'll be on CBC, on the main network. I made the film to make the point that we're all implicated.
Thank you.
This is very important. It's very important, and it's very important on a number of levels. I just want to comment on this actually quite personally. It's a point that isn't actually shown in the film. Of course, you have hard choices to make whenever you make a film, but it always is very emotional for me to think about where I grew up and where I lived in Saskatoon, and the part of Saskatoon in particular where I lived and where we lived, which is the west side, and it was definitely a less desirable part of the city. And the people we bought our house from, one of them went running one morning, and just outside of Saskatoon, and found young Neil Stonechild face down in the snow. So for those of you who don't know this story, the Saskatoon police had a very pretty name for a very nasty piece of business. And Johnny MacDonald says in 1885, when he implements the pass system ever so enthusiastically, he says, and again, it's not in the film, but he says, should they fail to produce such permits, they should be compelled to leave the precincts of said towns and villages. It's a direct echo. There are indirect echoes. There are things that are amorphous about colonization and things that hide in plain sight. What MacDonald is saying is exactly what the Saskatoon police were doing in the 1990s. So these kinds of things persist in many ways, and I made the point not only to say that we're implicated, but that the film, even though it talks about the past, is really about the present. So thank you for your comments. Thank you. It's one of the elders, the first elder in the film that you see, the man, Rosie Red Crow is gone, but as he says, she's not far, which actually I thought was really, really beautiful. He said, you know, I was born into it. To me, that says in those, whatever, 4 or 3 words or something, so much. And, you know, non-Indigenous people in this country have been born into this history of colonization. And I see around them, wherever they look, reinforcements of their supposed authority and supposed legitimacy. And yet, you know, it's unfounded. And also, it's just not the way you act when you're a guest. Right? So, and just another really small comment. I mean, the roots of incarceration have their roots here. They have their roots in residential schools, and the Canadian state didn't even listen to its own white people. They didn't listen to Bryce in 1922 when he goes around and says, this is a national crime. Stop. Stop it. They didn't listen to him. So it takes the will of many, and many different kinds of people to say that. Also, I'm clearly white, but it's always nice to see some of my Lebanese family came here, and I just want to share that when we moved to Saskatoon, I actually completely, like many, erased my Lebanese heritage. My name actually is Abu Sama. That's what the name I was born with. So when we moved to Saskatchewan, I wanted that to disappear. I wanted to fold into the mainstream as best I could. It was the front line of that kind of colonization for kids is ridicule. And so, there you go. Anyway, just thank you for your comments. The response in Saskatchewan was, in fact, electric. Actually, I'll just share a little. Luann and I went to the same high school for 1 year, and I just wanted to share also, particularly along that line, that the Saskatchewan School Board was very interested, and Nutana, where we went to school for 1 year, did 2 screenings there and screened to like the whole student body. In Treaty 7 as well, and parts of Treaty 6, the biggest screening I've screened for, this is a big crowd, but near St. Paul, Alberta, at Blue Quills Residential School, which is now Blue Quills University, where people bussed in from all over to see the film, and there was 450 people. The screen just wasn't big enough. I wish we had this one. And the response, both from the academic response was really interesting, because I sort of naively thought that I would just turn a corner and talk to some historian who would say, oh yes, I know everything about the past system, blah, blah, blah. But that just wasn't the case. And it's partly the case because it's so incredible, actually, the lack of documents that you will actually not find at the National Archives. And I really, really, really looked, because I knew from a non-Indigenous community that there could be skepticism of this. So I wanted to button this story as factually as I could, and I knew. So, sorry, I'm taking a while to answer this, but I went up and down the Indian Affairs chain at the National Archives in Ottawa, and I found 2 passes in 56 years where it operates in its kind of full form. Many historians from all over had said, well, that's a very interesting topic. But they actually, some of them didn't think it was very effective. But they thought it wasn't very effective based on the lack of documents. So even when I spoke to the Indian Affairs historian, and if anybody knows anything about this kind of stuff, the buildings across the pond, the river from Ottawa, are mostly lawyers and administrators. There's 1 historian. That's it. So, and a graduate student in the summer. Yeah, the response was very, very interested. I've followed up the conversations for a long time with each of these historians, and all the elders in the film have seen the film. And I guess just one last point on this, because I didn't realize, I knew starting out that we needed to hear from the elders to emotionally understand what happened. That was clear. I didn't realize that that we needed to hear from them as evidence, purely as evidence, because the government hid this from themselves. That's the most disturbing part. But I think colonization benefits from amnesia. It's a very good question. There are reports of mobility being controlled in different environments, and to me, it's I titled the film "The Pass System" because I grew up not knowing what the heck it was, and the government tried to bury it, and I think people should know that it had a name and pass laws existed here, and they existed in a very Canadian way. Different than South Africa, different than other countries that have mobility restrictions. And I think it's really important to have the discussion that you're talking about, and that's what I'm pressing the minister for. But like everything else, like residential schools, I think it's an extreme dishonor to this country that residential school survivors had to be the ones to lead the charge. It wasn't a crisis of conscience in the Canadian people that said, oh my God, we have done something, our ancestors have done something so heinous that we are going to elect the most fierce leaders who will bring this to justice. And we are not going to burden survivors with that. We are going to hold this history together, and we're going to take responsibility for it. And I think this kind of thing is very similar. I'm very honored to have spoken with those elders in the film. They trusted me with their stories. They trusted me with taking a little piece out of the big wall. When people talk about resilience, I have tremendous admiration for people who stand in the winds of colonization like that and remain intact. So I think it's very important. I've heard stories from Haida Gwaii, New Brunswick, of mobility being controlled. This is something that people need to understand has the sense of belonging. Non-Indigenous people have no sense of not belonging to the territory, to the second biggest country in the world. No problem. And it doesn't need to be said what would happen if you said to a white person, well, you know, if you want to go to Brossard, you got to ask for my say-so. Doesn't need to be said. But if you're born into it, and if the lever of coercion is, we have your food because the buffalo are gone, you're not a citizen, so you can't hire a lawyer, and more importantly, and religion, you can't practice anything you're doing, but most importantly, we have your kids. They are wards of the state. They're not yours. They're ours. So that crisis of conscience in the Canadian populace is something that needs to happen so that people vote for politicians who are prepared to make the kinds of decisions that need to be made to turn people who are dominant into people who are respectful guests. But that's a long journey. We're doing this for our children's 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 children's.